COP28 is underway in Dubai, and we're going to be talking to Calgary physician Dr. Joe Vipond, who's attending the sessions there. And he joins us now from his hotel room. So, welcome to the interview, Joe.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Markham. It's been a while since we've chatted.
Well, you know what? I remember interviewing you at the COP20. I forget which one it was, the one in Scotland, if I'm not mistaken.
26.
And the your set this time is a lot better. And hey, you've got the emissions cap on.
There we go. Yeah, this was distributed. There's about 100 of these floating around COP, and it's making an impact. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten the premiers to wear them yet, and I won't hold our breath.
No, I don't imagine Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who's there with a delegation of about, I don't know, 100 people from Alberta, will be wearing the emissions cap, but bring one back for me, Joe. Now, look,
Okay, well,
there are approximately 70,000 people who have gathered for COP28. What's it like there?
I think the official numbers are 97K, if you can believe it. Like, it's immense. It's a huge space. There's a lot of controversy about this one, partly because of the Sultan, who of course is the CEO of ADNOC, which is the United Arab Emirates national oil company, and then all the oil and gas people here. There was a news release yesterday that talked about the number of fossil fuel lobbyists here, and it's huge. You know, Exxon's here for the first time. The Alberta government, as you've mentioned, has brought its contingent. Saskatchewan's brought its contingent. So there's this talk about it being a fossil fuel COP, which I guess means they're scared. So got to be happy about that.
Well, we've had some debate over the last couple of months because in September, Calgary was the location for the 24th World Petroleum Congress. And the global industry, and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was a very vocal proponent of this, was very much pushing a slow energy transition kind of narrative. They were saying that, look, you know, our forecasts show that oil demand is going to grow out to 2045 quite significantly, and then it's going to decline very slowly. Are they pushing this narrative in Dubai?
So it's the narrative that the Alberta government and the Saskatchewan government is pushing is that they're all in on climate through their preferred mechanisms. But their preferred mechanisms essentially is CCUS, and you know, they're large emitter carbon pricing schemes, and that's it. There's no talk about transition. There's no talk about phase out. When that's brought up, it's, well, we're going to have oil and gas for decades, and so it's pretty clear that their intention for being here is to continue the status quo as long as possible, and then rely on these unproven technologies to get us the rest of the way. And I guess I'll throw in some small modular nuclear reactors in there too, just to round out what their narrative is.
Right. It seems to me that what they're saying is that they're all in on climate policy, and what they mean by an emissions reduction. That's a big point, because
it's not about phasing out fossil fuels. It's about phasing out emissions. But the problem, as probably your educated listeners know, is they're talking about scope 1 and 2 emissions. There's no discussion of scope 3 emissions, which are the vast majority of the CO2 that comes from producing these. And I was in kind of a verbal repartee with the Pathways Alliance group today, and they're saying, well, they're just going to transition to materials like petrochemicals. And then they forget to mention that petrochemicals is plastics, which is another crisis that's of course happening. So, and let's face it, as great as it would be to go to non-combustible oil use, there's just not the same volume of bitumen or oil required to fulfill those needs. So they're in an existential fight, honestly.
Well, we here at Energy Media have actually championed the transition away, the transition to using oil and gas
Oh,
as
I'm aware.
feedstocks for manufacturing. So we'll leave. You and I can debate that another day, Joe.
Sounds fair.
The point here is that the way they're defining emissions reduction is emissions reduction on the 20% that comes from the production of oil and gas, not the
Right.
80% that comes when that oil is refined into a diesel or gasoline or aviation fuel and then combusted.
Right. And let's be clear, they're relying on technologies that are unproven. So there are two major CCS facilities in Western Canada. There's Boundary Dam. It's had about 50% of its emissions captured over the lifespan of the CCS project. And then there's Quest, which interestingly enough is the one that's like championed all the time as the model for what to do. And there was an analysis a couple of years ago that showed that the first 5 years, it captured 48% of the emissions. So that means more CO2 went into the atmosphere at that project than was captured. And, that's not good enough if we're talking about phasing out fossil fuels. The new facility is going to be $16 billion. They want the majority of the funding to come from the federal and provincial governments, and their narrative is that these are high risk projects, and therefore they need to de-risk. And high risk means they're worried it's going to come in slow, over budget, and maybe not work. So that's not good. And then the final narrative that I like to point out to people is that the oil and gas industry earned 65-ish billion in 2022, and they're asking the government to pay the bills, and I don't know, it just doesn't sit well with me.
Is there any discussion of a question we've asked at Energy Media here many times, which is if the federal government is going to fund all or part of the CCUS for the oil sands, for the oil and gas industry in Western Canada, are those companies going to be competitive if the International Energy Agency is correct? Oil and gas demand peaks by 2030, declines in the 2030s, and some of those companies are not competitive. And we wind up with stranded assets that the taxpayer has paid for. And I haven't been able to get a straight answer as to whether the governments who are footing the bill have actually modeled that competitiveness out to 2050. I mean, you'd think that would be basic kind of analysis, right?
Yeah, they do want not only the CapEx, the capital expenditures subsidized, but the OpEx, the operational expenses. So that again is de-risking these projects for these very, very wealthy companies. The sad thing is that when you listen to the narratives, every single company wants to be the last oil of barrel burned. That's the narrative out of everybody, and it can't all be true. So with our very, very high emissions oil, I think we need to be thinking proactively about how to deal with that, considering carbon intensity is going to be a factor in who's going to be being able to provide that last barrel of oil.
Joe, I'm very curious to know if there's a lot of discussion or any discussion at COP28 about the energy transition and whether it'll be a slow one like OPEC says, or it'll be a fast one like the IEA says, because that seems to be, in my opinion, that would be the bigger determinant of how fast the demand for oil and gas declines.
Well, who's having the conversation? I would say that the oil and gas companies are really pushing this is going to be a decades process. And then those people like myself who are concerned about, say, all of our boreal forest burning down this last summer and very, very unusual temperatures going right through to now, and what that means going forward, are pushing if we want to survive as a civilization, we better get off of this as soon as possible. We're late to the game. So there's 97,000 of us talking, and it depends on which corner of the room you're listening to.
What is the response from the COP28 attendees in general to the presence of the oil and gas delegates there? That's been fairly controversial in the media that I've read.
Yeah, well, I think I could get the number wrong, but it's somewhere around 24,000 or 2,400, which is four times what it was last year, which is at 600. Um, and so the narrative on the oil and gas side is that they produce so much emissions that they need to be at the table. Otherwise, their expertise and their knowledge, their capabilities aren't going to be utilized to the best efforts. And I think from my perspective and many others it would be that time and time again, these companies have not proven themselves to be honest actors in this space. And there's no reason to suspect that they are now. I mean, look at what's happened over the last year as far as BP, Total, Shell, Suncor, all saying that they have no intention of transitioning off of fossil fuels. So how are we to take when someone shows you who they are, when a company shows you who they are, you believe them. And so, yeah, I don't think they're helping. I think they're here to hurt.
Well, speaking of bad faith actors, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was in the news yesterday with their severe criticisms of the federal government's new methane emissions regulations. Is Smith making much of a splash in COP28? Are people paying attention to what she says?
My sense is that the reason why the 100 people were brought was to fill the rooms that she's in. I think she's speaking to the Alberta converted and is not getting out much more beyond that. Uh, I was curious about her resistance to this because time and time again, we've heard Alberta oil companies champion how great they've done with the methane transition, how important they think it is. So I actually went and looked at their energy transition. So there being the UCP's energy, climate plan that they came out with around the election time, and they're trying to get to 75 to 80% of emissions reductions by 2030, which is actually more ambitious than what was announced yesterday. So I'm just confused by this. And the other element that's a little bit weird is that the United States government made the same announcement 2 weeks ago for 75% reduction by 2030. And we generally are pretty comfortable with doing what they're doing. I mean, we're just as technically capable and ambitious as they are, right? So why the nuclear response? Other than, any fight with Ottawa is a good fight, I guess.
Yes, well, any viewers who haven't read my column from yesterday can check it out on energy.media, where I make essentially that argument and go into some more depth about why Smith's position is simply not tenable. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
It's the cheapest way to reduce emissions. You can't come to a climate conference and say you're there to do good and then resist all the work that goes towards reducing emissions. Even the simplest, cheapest, makes no sense while you're riding your moratorium on renewables that you installed 5 months ago.
Well, Premier Smith is nothing if not completely inconsistent. So but what else is going on at COP28 that caught your attention, Joe?
Well, it's a big event. There's tons of stuff going on all the time. I'm wearing kind of three hats, well, aside from my emissions cap. So I'm supporting the debunking of the Alberta and Saskatchewan narratives and other oil company narratives. Actually, you can follow my work, Debunction Junction with 2Ks, the hashtag on Twitter, and I'm having a good time deep diving some of the narratives. So that's one thing that I'm doing. The second thing I'm doing is working on the coal work. We were very successful in Alberta and Canada in getting off coal. The last bit of coal is going to be burned in June of next year in Alberta, about 6 years ahead of schedule. And now we need to be able to take that forward to the rest of the world. And so I'm working with the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is basically started by the UK feds and the Canadian feds, and it's really exciting to see that roll out across the world. And then the last thing I'm doing is doing a lot of health work as well, because this is the first year that health had its own day. That's really important, to connect the climate calamity outside to what's happening to us. They say that health is the human face of climate, and so the physician voice is increasingly important. And it's been a big step forward this year with the recognition of that.
Well, Joe, we'll talk to you when you get back from COP28. Keep up the good work, and we'll thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thanks for your interest.